Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I want to apologize off the top that it's just me, little old me. I really wanted to get like a very diverse panel together to talk about this topic, and perhaps I will someday if it's still relevant, which hopefully it's not. Um, but I wasn't able to pull together a panel in time, but I did have some thoughts. And given that this is pretty topical at the moment, given the Hunter Shcafer snafu, I wanted to just jump on here and kind of do a little bit of like a decolonial analysis of what has happened and what transmedicalism is and my perspective on things as a non-binary agender person. So, with that being said, if you don't know what happened with Hunter Shcafer, do not fear. I will be going through the entire thing today. However, she's really not the focus of the stream today. It's more of a good excuse and a good example of transmedicalism that we can use as a jumping off point to have a larger conversation. I think when these things happen, it's important for us to call celebrities in and to highlight when people are doing things that are harmful, especially when they have such a huge platform. But at the same time, I don't think it's often very constructive to focus on the individual too much. I think it's more appropriate to look at the underpinnings of why something is happening and what the significance is for the people that it impacts, which is a lot of what I'm going to do hopefully today. So, with all that being said, hi. If you don't know who I am, I'm Nick, as you can see from my name tag here. I run the YouTube channel and podcast Pink Spots. The YouTube channel has been pretty defunct for a while, but I do have plans for it. And as I mentioned, I identify as agender. I also identify as non-binary and genderqueer. These all kind of have their own nuances to them, but it all falls under generally the non-binary umbrella. And so I felt a certain way when hearing these transmedicalist arguments about, who gets to be actually trans, who gets to take up space in the queer community, etc. I am white, as you can see. And so I, again, apologize. I did want to have more diversity on the stream, but it's sometimes hard to organize panels, especially given that I've been dealing with some health stuff. So I do want to try to include a lot of different perspectives, but I will, obviously acknowledge that I am white and am trying not to speak for other people while trying to also include other perspectives. So we'll see how I do. All right, so to kick it off, I want to start from the beginning. I want to start with the post. So again, if you're not familiar, Hunter Shcafer is an actress. She is a very well-known young trans woman. She does a lot of work advocating for trans people, especially for trans youth, and has a pretty good reputation in the community before this whole incident. She's on Euphoria, starring as Jules, so that's her claim to fame. And what happened essentially is this person called Piggy Taiwan, that's her Instagram name, posted something that is very overtly transmedicalist, and we're going to go through the post together in a moment. And Hunter Shcafer liked it and then left a comment that was just all like exclamation points, which seems to be, some sort of approval of the post. So this caused, a huge snafu because a lot of non-binary people and even a lot of binary trans people were very upset to see someone who's so prominent in the trans community signing off on something that's so hateful. And Hunter did post a follow-up clarification, we'll say, not really an apology, and we'll look at that and analyze that as well. So to start, here's the original post. This is all kind of long, so just hang in there with me, but I think we'll kind of talk about it as we go through. So the original post says, I hope all of the people, NBs, which for those who may not know, that's kind of like a nickname for non-binary people, NB, non-binary, who fought to have trans identities no longer considered a medical condition that requires dysphoria are happy because you've won. The red states are beginning to agree with you. HRT and gender affirming surgery are no longer deemed medically necessary for adults in Florida, and it's not going to stop there. That means more trans people will have to pay for their transitions out of pocket, forcing more of us into sex work. Y'all just couldn't stand to let binary trans people be the voice of this community. So before we move on, I just want to point out that I think a lot of us here will just understand how inherently ridiculous it is to think that any marginalized community is going to have an overwhelming impact on state legislation. So just out of the gate, it's like, I'm sorry, I didn't realize non-binary people had so much political power. Like, I should have been, out here changing more policy if I had known. But I think also really important is that since 2012, the DSM-5 has stated that dysphoria is not required in order to, have a valid trans identity and need gender-affirming medical intervention. So to frame this as something new is really inaccurate. This is something that has been in, the medical framework that's always used to determine these policies has stated that dysphoria is not required for over 10 years now. So I just want to point that out. Like, not only is the putting the blame on non-binary peoples having suddenly all this political power that can push legislation through in these states inaccurate, but it's also inaccurate to state that this concept of not needing dysphoria is new. It's not new. And essentially what she's saying here is that she believes that it's correct that trans identities should be medicalized, meaning that transness should be seen as a medical condition akin to a mental illness. And the purpose for that is to, uh, what's the word I'm looking for, is to guarantee, I guess, that binary trans people can have access to medical care. So I want to say I have a lot of sympathy and empathy that, of course, all of us in the trans community are scared right now. Things are not great out there, and we're scared of losing our rights and our access to things. However, this is one of those arguments and conversations that happens within a community of, are we going to try to protect ourselves by placating and adhering to oppressive structures? Or are we going to advocate for ourselves by trying to dismantle those structures? So what she's referencing, and I would say a lot of binary trans people also feel this way, is that there are a lot of people in the trans community who don't want trans identity seen as a mental illness or a medical disability. But it's not in order to get medical care taken away. It's actually in order to make medical care more available to more people. So as I mentioned, I identify as agender. I am someone who doesn't really I don't experience a lot of body dysphoria, gender dysphoria around my body or my genitals, but I would like a very drastic breast reduction, not quite top surgery, not quite to the point of wanting pecs. I would still like to have breasts, but I would like them to be teeny tiny. And I don't think I can understand how a lot of people would dismiss that as not gender affirming surgery. All I can say is it very much would be for me. I would very much feel so much more comfortable in my gender, in my body, if I was able to get that surgery. But depending on where I live, it could be hard, if not impossible, to get that surgery as gender affirming surgery because in most places, you have to have dysphoria. It's gotten better, although now I think we're seeing it backslide. But in many places, you have to have gender dysphoria, and you have to kind of prove that you're trans. So you have to sort of prove this by doing things like going on hormones for a year before you're allowed to get surgery. So this is where, someone like me might advocate for making a trans identity not a mental illness, because I don't experience dysphoria necessarily around my chest, but I still would like this gender affirming surgery. And I don't want to go on hormones. That's not the path I want to take. So for me, it would be really helpful if I could just be believed and there was some kind of process that wasn't oriented around dysphoria to give me a pathway to that. Fortunately, I've also had back problems my whole life. So I may be able to get a breast reduction covered by insurance for alleviating my back problems. But if I wanted something else, I might not be able to have any pathway to that. And, it would be nice for me to be able to get the surgery as gender affirming surgery and not need some other workaround to get access to the care that I want and need. Okay. So I wanted to say all of that. And I also want to add in here that a lot of non-binary people, honestly, probably 80 to 90% of the non-binary people I know do medically transition. They do go on HRT, they do have gender affirming surgeries. I know I'm one of the only non-binary people I know who either hasn't or doesn't want to do these things. So it is also a false dichotomy that binary trans people get and want surgery and non-binary trans people do not. That's just false. It's very provably, obviously false. And there's a weird, it's like a circular logic, because transmedicalists will say that they're mad at non-binary people because non-binary people are endangering their access to surgery, gender affirming medical treatments, because they have this idea that like you should just be fine in your body and not need anything. And because they don't experience, this is what transmedicalists say, because non-binary people don't experience dysphoria, then they're a threat, they're threatening the dysphoria pathway to medical treatment. But then at the same time, I've also seen them argue almost in the same breath that non-binary people will get gender affirming treatments and then detransition because they don't experience dysphoria. Then this is part of like they're not really trans argument. And then that makes trans people look bad. So it's just like they're arguing on all sides. Like no matter what non-binary people do, apparently we're just embarrassing and threatening the movement and taking away the real trans people's access to things that they need. So that's important to keep in mind as we go through all of this, is that, yeah, a lot of non-binary people do have dysphoria. I'm going to talk about this more in depth. We experience dysphoria that can be very complicated and may not be easily categorized as dysphoria in the way that binary trans people experience it. So I think that's part of the problem, is it's just not recognizable to a lot of people. But a lot of us also experience just straight up regular old gender dysphoria. A lot of non-binary people have very similar dysphoria to binary trans people. And so it's just a very, very false and unnecessary dichotomy that's being created here to pit these two sides of what should be the same community against each other. I'm not saying that there's not differences. There certainly can be differences in what a binary trans person and non-binary trans person might need for support. But that doesn't mean that we're somehow inherently opposed to one another, that those needs are detrimental to one another. It's creating this straw man, non-binary person who's like somehow ruining everything when most of us are just like chilling, you know? And I also do want to have the caveat I'm extremely offline for a online content creator. So I do make a lot of space. I do want to make a lot of space today for the fact that there may be things happening on TikTok or Twitter or wherever that I don't see. So I want to make space for that. Like maybe there are a lot of non-binary identifying people who are taking up a lot of space on TikTok. I don't know. I'm not on there. I couldn't tell you. So I don't want to completely invalidate that like there may potentially be some issues within the community of who is like taking up a lot of space and who's saying what, out of turn. But generally when I hear these arguments, I'm kind of like everyone keeps saying the same thing, but I'm like, but where is it? Like where is this person who's taking up all this space and speaking over? Cuz a lot of people are saying, "Oh, these like white women non-binary, people are speaking over everyone else and they're being lifted up as the voice of the community." And I'm like, by who? Where? I don't, again, I'm not online. So like, yes, I wouldn't doubt that there are some annoying people because there's annoying people everywhere that are doing that and they should, chill out. But when I look at, if I'm looking at like podcasts, YouTube, uh, media in general, like I don't see a lot of non-binary people who are being posed as like the voice of the trans community. It's still like I feel that the larger population outside of queer spaces like doesn't even really understand what non-binary people are, like who non-binary people are, and find us very confusing and also think that we're not real. So I don't see that we're getting like a ton of huge platforms in which to speak. And I even think about the top trans YouTubers are all binary trans, the top trans actresses or actors, as a gender neutral term, are all binary trans for the most part. There's one or two that are non-binary, but I don't want to like put down that trans people should have more of a platform. I think they certainly should. But I do want to push back a bit on this idea that like suddenly non-binary people are just have taken over the conversation or are being given all the platforms is just not something that I have seen. All right. Where were we in this steaming pile of shit? So we had y'all just couldn't stand to let binary trans people be the voice of this community. You had to dismantle all of the guidelines around being trans to fit your narrative so you could feel valid. And then you demonized trans people who challenged your ideals and called them true scum slash transmedicalists. So true scum is like a slur, so to speak, against transmedicalist people. And transmedicalists are a lot like racists, where it's like if you call them transmedicalists, then they think that you're being a bully or abusive. So a lot of them also consider transmedicalists a slur, very similar to TERFs as well, who consider TERF a slur. She continues to say, what you don't understand is that binary trans women and men don't have the luxury of playing around with what it means to be trans the same way you do. You challenge gender ideologies from the safety of a cis body that requires no medical treatment. We have to play the game and live by the guidelines that cis people have created for us because that is how we survive. So it's extremely violent to tell a non-binary person they have a cis body. I just want to say that out of the gate. I have anyone who's followed my work for a long time, I talk about queerness a lot. And this is something we see with any queer identity is that there's a lot of gatekeeping around who can use the label. And there's a lot of hand wringing about, well, what if people appropriate this label? And I get it. It's annoying, right? It's annoying to have people come in and kind of like appropriate your experience and whatever. But what I would say too is that I don't find it useful to spend my energy worried about gatekeeping. I think people are going to do what they're going to do. This is always going to happen no matter what. And I think the very concept of deciding who is something is always inherently going to be oppressive and exclusionary and problematic. So, what I mean by that is like, sure, sometimes I can see some people who might use the label of queer or non-binary or whatever and be like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's deep in your soul, a part of your experience on the earth. I don't know if you have like a queer perspective or a non-binary perspective. But for me to police that is for me to then add to the narrative that there's a right way to be queer or a right way to be trans. And that only hurts queer and trans people. Okay. And we also have to let go of this idea that these things are a steady state. And this is what drives me the most bonkers about this whole ordeal and transmedicalism in general is that I think even any binary trans person would be very aware of having had a process of experimenting with their gender, figuring out what their gender even was, experimenting with a new name, experimenting with pronouns and with style of dress and with makeup and, or whatever, cutting their hair short, whatever it might be that felt gender affirming. We all have a process of like figuring it out. So it also feels very strange to take a non-binary person who may be in early stages of this process of transitioning and to say, oh, you're cis, you're not really trans because you're not like doing the most. And it's like, but very few of us do the most right out of the gate. Very few of us have access to the resources we might need. It's very few trans people realize they're trans and then immediately start hormone therapy. It's that's not how it works. Like there's usually a very long, and again, because of the medical industry gatekeeping treatment through dysphoria and all of these other things, a lot of times you have to take these steps in order to get access to these more visible forms of transitioning. So a lot of places you'll have to have used a different name. You in public, like you had to have been living by another name. You have to be very visibly, like people talk about going in and if they say identify as a trans woman, going into these appointments, they have to dress like super high femme because otherwise they won't be believed as like quote unquote real trans people. So it just feels like hurt people hurt people. Like this just feels like a lot of externalized trauma that's being directed at, someone who's similar but not the same, in order to make yourself feel better. Because it's harmful. It's very harmful to say that someone isn't trans enough because they're not trans in the way that you recognize, because that's exactly what cis people do to trans people. It's playing into these same systems of oppression that added to the trauma in the first place. So I wanted to say that. So then we get, you're not helping, you're not dismantling the gender binary. Sorry, you're not expanding the minds of cis people. You're making them hate us. For the last time, I'm begging non-binary people to take a seat and let binary trans people, this is my favorite part, and more specifically, Black trans women be the voices of this community because they're the ones at risk. So this person is a white woman. And I just find this pretty disgusting, honestly. I think this is extremely performative. And this is something that a lot of right-wing people do, where they'll have like a really hateful post or speech or whatever it is. And then at the end, they just tuck in something that it's like, you'd have to be a monster to disagree with this. So it's like, yes, I agree. Black trans women should always have a bigger platform, right? They are the ones most at risk. They are the ones most systemically disadvantaged. And they're also the ones that do the most work in the movement and lead lead a lot of the queer um, movements that we have. So, sure, I agree, but that doesn't erase like all of the shit that you set up here. So, this just really set me off on my ear. I was like, I fucking see you. This is ridiculous. And what it does is it's almost kind of like a reverse dog whistle, if that makes sense, where it's allowing other people who hold the same hateful beliefs to agree with those hateful beliefs, but have this cover of like, oh no, I was just agreeing with the nice part that everyone agrees with, which dun 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 is exactly what happens. Spoiler alert. When we see Hunter's follow up to this. So, I had a question. I'm going to try to keep up with comments as we go. Someone asked if I identify as trans. I don't know. I have thought about that a lot, and I genuinely kind of don't know. Um, and my struggle with it is this. So, and my struggle with it honestly is rooted in a lot of what this person is saying. And my problem is I don't want to let some ignorant minority, drive how I identify. So in that case, I want to say, yes, I'm trans. I want to have solidarity with the trans community. I want to be part of it. But sometimes I do feel like I'm appropriating or I'm not trans enough or my experience is so different. I think being agender is such a particular experience that if it just sometimes it feels hard to know where I fit in all of this. So that's my messy non-answer is like I don't really know. I do like in spirit, I do in the definition of like anyone who's not cis is trans. I do identify as trans. But yeah, I also have a lot of anxiety, and this post part of why I even got involved in this because I don't tend to again, I'm not online. I don't even remember how I found out about this whole thing. But I don't tend to really jump on these internet things because I don't really care. But like this post hurt me. It did. It hurt me. And it tapped into some stuff that like I worry about a lot. Like, do I look queer enough? How do I look queer enough to be queer? How do I look agender? How the fuck does anyone look like I don't think gender exists and I don't identify with any of it. Like what is the wardrobe for that? What is the aesthetic for that? And especially as someone with like I'm in a bigger body right now. I have a lot of estrogen dominance because of my illness. So even though I don't want to go on testosterone, I also feel very uncomfortable that like my body is so dominated by estrogen, but then I'm like, is that tapping into problematic stuff and I should just decolonize that? Like, what does this mean for my identity? So it's just very false to say that like non-binary people don't experience a lot of dysphoria and discomfort. We do. It's just harder to categorize and talk about um, for a lot of people. And even people who do transition in a way that looks very like one thing to another thing, a lot of them have the same feelings. A lot of them are like, okay, this is the closest approximation I can get to how I feel on the inside. But a big part of why people identify as non binary is because they're like, but there's no real thing that's exactly how I feel, or this struggle is kind of always going to be with me here. Or a lot of my dysphoria is just externally imposed on me. It doesn't come from my body. It comes from how people treat me and how society treats me, and even how things are interpreted that I do. I was talking to a friend a while ago, but I was telling her like when I wear makeup, makeup to me is not feminine. Not when I wear it. I don't wear makeup in a feminine way. I don't think like, "Oh, I'm gonna be more femme today." That's not how I process it, but I know it's how other people process it, and I've said this before, but I tend to get more compliments when I wear makeup and when I look a bit more femme, and that really fucks with me because it's like it's just one side, it's just like a spectrum of aesthetics that I like. And that's just how I think of it. I don't think of it in terms of gender, but everyone around me is always processing things in terms of gender. So I can't ever get away from it no matter what I do, you know? And especially again, being in a body that's bigger, that, I have wide hips and big old boobs saddled with these big old milk sacks. That's how people are going to see me. They're always going to see me like the closest I can get is people thinking I'm like a butch lesbian, maybe, which is fine and very hot, but not my identity. And it's very hard to walk around in a body and an experience where you're like, I can never communicate to people properly what what I feel on the inside. And that's something that doesn't need to take up space over binary people's gender dysphoria and need for medical care, but it is part of the trans experience. And it does need to have space in the community for people to talk about that and how uncomfortable it is and how frustrating it is. And there is a little bit of inherent tension there because a binary trans person, by and large, nothing is monolith, but like by and large, is looking to kind of approximate a cisgender expression. And for people like me, cisgenderism is harmful. It's exactly what causes me to have these issues all the day is because we have these gender roles and these preconceived notions of what something means when someone does it. So very long-winded answer. I don't know, but yeah, I want to feel that I'm part of the trans community, but I just don't know. It's hard to know, and it's hard to know when you go online. I think a lot of the trans people I know in person, we don't even really worry about it. This all feels like a very online kind of experience and probably like a young experience too. Uh, but yeah, it's pretty rough, and I wanna think that dismantling this stuff benefits all of us, but I think this is also where a lot of these arguments happen because someone like me, I really wanna smash the binary. But at the same time, like, I understand that for some people, the binary is really gender affirming and they feel that they need it. So, again, we're kind of inherently at odds, but I don't think we need to be enemies. I don't think we need to talk over each other. I don't think we need to try to be doing things that are going to hurt one another. I think we can just talk and like understand each other's perspective. Um, so yeah, okay, I'll leave that there for now. Carrie said, I don't remember what book I read recently that said not queer as in gay, queer as in undefinable. And that's how I feel about my gender. Shrug emoji. And that's perfect. That's exactly it. I think we really misunderstand queerness, and I think non-binary identities are inherently extremely queer. And, we always talk about this, like, everyone gets to be under the queer umbrella, sure. But, like, when you talk about queer theory, queer practice, what you're really talking about is something that constantly challenges the status quo. And as we see the trans binary existence being slightly more, again, I don't want to insinuate that trans people aren't still facing horrid discrimination and escalating discrimination. They are, but I think, like, as a thing that exists, it's a bit more understood. It's at least a thing that people are like, "Okay, yeah, people are that thing, even if I don't agree with it." Kind of like gay people, right? Like, even if people hate gays, they kind of, like, get it now that some people are gay. And I think non-binary is like the bisexual or the pansexual. Non-binary is something that's emerging from this and saying, well, okay, yeah, but there's more, and not to say we're more than trans people, but saying there's just endless shades and varieties, and it's not something you can just put in a box and say, oh, okay, I understand it now. Like, it's this ever emerging, ever evolving thing. And a lot of us are coming out of this as people who don't want and don't fit into any binary or any set label. And we want to challenge things, we want to agitate, and that's a very queer thing to do. And I think some of the tension here, a lot of the tension here, is that you have people who, again, would fall under this queer umbrella, but really what they want is just to, like, be fine and left alone. They don't want to challenge anything, they just want to get what they want. And you see that with, like, white gays, in marriage and middle class existence. They're like, okay, we're good now. We don't want anything else. We want people to see us as, like, good upstanding citizens and not a threat, and just normal. Like, we just want to be seen as normal. And I think this, the transmedicalism, I think, comes out of the trans version of that. Like, I just want to be seen as normal. I want to be left alone. I want everyone to just accept me as I am. And I don't want to cause any problems. And I don't want any problems caused for me. And again, of course, I, like, have a measure of sympathy for that, because all of us want to have nice lives where we get what we need and are left alone, largely. But it doesn't mean that queer people who are agitating are wrong or doing something inherently harmful necessarily. All right, so here's Piggy Taiwan's follow-up. It's been 24 hours since I posted this on my story. I just want to say thank you to all the people who were receptive to my point of view. I heard from dozens of other trans women and men who shared the same sentiments, so I'm posting it here as well. But I just want to be clear. This kills me. I just want to be clear that I do not think that NB people are solely responsible for this anti-trans movement we're seeing in red states and right-wing spaces. Well, thank you for that. There are many contributing factors. I do, however, think that the people who are not medically transitioning and navigate their queerness through the privilege of a cis body, there it is again, need to take a step back from preaching validity based on gender theory and think about how the language they're using affects binary trans people in the real world, i.e., take a goddamn break from spewing gender abolition rhetoric and putting so much emphasis on non-transitional, non-medical transitions. That's all fine and good, and your prerogative as an individual, but maybe let's focus more on the people who do need medical treatment and don't have access before we focus on your niche experience with gender divergence. Non-transitional, non-binary people taking up space on platforms that claim to be raising up trans voices and using that platform to talk about non-priority issues, like the validity of a femme presenting they fab's transness when Black trans women she had to do it again. When Black trans women are still facing unprecedented levels of systemic and physical violence is not okay. All caps. Until we fix that issue, quite frankly, I don't give a shit about non-binary issues or the validity of their identity. It's extremely narcissistic and tone deaf. Uplift the voices of the people who need to be heard and protected, and then find some other avenue to get the attention you so desperately seek. So, in some ways more offensive than the original post. For those who don't know, they fabs and less frequently used they mabs is like a slur against non-binary AFAB people. If you don't know what AFAB is, it's assigned female at birth. So people who would be perceived as women by society or were assigned that female role at birth. And I noticed this too in a lot of the rhetoric, that it seems to target AFAB people specifically, like, way more. Like, I didn't ever come across the term they mab until I looked up the definition of they fab just to make sure I understood it. And it was like, oh, it could be like they fab or they mab. So I think it says a lot too, because a lot of these posts, like, talk about trans misogyny, which is very real, and femmephobia is very real. These are issues not just with cis sexism, but these are issues in queer communities as well. And it just, the irony of it, basically, the irony that the focus and the hate is all being directed towards AFAB people is just very interesting to me. It's like this lack of self-awareness of, like, you're kind of doing the thing that you're saying that they're doing. I just, it's just a lot more of the same. It's just a lot more of the same. And again, this idea that like our experience is a niche experience is interesting. Certainly, we're not like the majority of the population, at least not yet. But I do think that the non binary experience kind of does pose a really good threat to the binary and to cis sexism. And so I do think it's a framework that could be liberating for like everybody. And so to call it niche as if we're supposed to just shut up and go away and be in our dark little day fab corner. Again, it just feels I read someone online called Transmedicalist, like the pick-me's of the trans community, and it does have that vibe to it. I also read a post by a Black woman who is not trans or non-binary, trans non-binary, but she was saying like she had observed all of this happening, and that for her it felt a lot like people in the Black community, like Black capitalists or Black neoliberals who blame like the poor community for making them look bad. And there's this like respectability politics happening, and I think that's it here too. There's this idea that like someone like me is not actually going through anything. Someone like me has never gone through anything that merits discussion or validation. um and certainly my experience is very different, and I and all other non-binary people I know who have different experiences are like very aware of that and not really looking to push. Sometimes I bring stuff up and I'm like, hey, from my perspective, this is a thing I think about. And then sometimes a binary trans person or even a non-binary person who wants to medically transition will be like, I find that a little problematic, or here's how that hits me, and I listen, and we have a conversation, and it's like there is going to be a tension there, I think sometimes, but it doesn't mean that we need to fight about it or that someone's harming the other person. It just means like we do have wildly different experiences, and we're going to have different analyses of our experiences, and that's okay. That's healthy and good in a lot of ways. So this all just, she basically just doubled down and calling non-binary people narcissistic. It's like everyone needs to stop using narcissism as a weapon. That's not okay. It's very ableist. Um, and also framing us as people who need attention. Whereas like most of the people I know who haven't like radically physically transitioned are often trying to take up as little space as possible. Um, and again, I make room for like, sure, there might be spaces that I'm not in where this is happening, I guess, sure. But like, we could say the same for anyone. Cis people say this about trans people all the time, like that they're just doing it to get attention. So again, it just feels like you're weaponizing something that was used against you, against someone else to like try to feel better. And that's not helpful. Okay. Let me check comments real quick. Paul, this is such a good comment. So Paul said, let me pull it up. I want to abolish gender while supporting binary trans people in the same way that I want to abolish money while supporting poor people. Maybe not a perfect metaphor, but does that make sense? Yes, this totally makes sense. Yes, exactly. Like, I get it. Some people are assholes and they say things and they don't account for the fact that like we're not there yet and that transition hasn't happened yet. So you can't just like say this. Like I can't just say abolish the binary. Like we're not there yet. We're still very heavily struggling under the cishet patriarchy. So it's like obviously we're not all going to wake up tomorrow and like use neo pronouns and all wear tunics and like whatever people think that means. But it doesn't mean that like there isn't a future that we can imagine where I don't know, it's just anyway, I don't want to get down this rabbit hole, but yes, I agree. I think that's a good analogy. I think that we can talk about these things and we can talk about how everyone feels and their experiences, because a lot of the trans trauma that I hear is from cis sexism and is from the binary. It's from people telling them that they can't be a certain way because of how they were born, or that there's this like impossible bar to meet before they'll ever be accepted. And for me, that's like, I'm like, yes, that's the thing I want to get rid of. That's it, because it sucks and it's harmful. So it's like, I think we have a lot more in common than we realize. And yes, I think like always support the people who are the most marginalized and the most impacted by a system of oppression, even as you set out to dismantle it. Hey, Mexi. What's up, girl? Uh, Paul also said, rich for a trans person argue that niche experiences don't matter. Yeah. Celeste said, money does seem way easier to abolish than gender to me. And I agree. I think it would just be like, I don't know. My vision for a perfect future is that you would just be able to put on whatever aesthetic you want. And like, it wouldn't have to mean anything. It's like we could all just be who we are and just live. But yeah, I agree. I think that's going to be extremely difficult. And so what's probably more realistic is just to have like a broader range of ways to identify, which is what I think we're in the messy, painful process of trying to do right now, right? We're trying to create these other categories for people to all feel like, okay, this is who I am. This actually really lines up with the nuances of my experience. And then hopefully at some point, whatever category you're in is fine and nobody cares. You know, just like with sexuality, that's how I hope sexuality is someday, is like you can identify a certain way or not, and it just won't really matter. Beyond the fact that, like, I think that's where people get mad, is because then they hear, like, oh, my experience doesn't matter. And I don't mean it that way. I mean that, like, it would not incite any kind of disgust or oppressive behavior in someone else. It would be like, cool, you know, like this is what I am, or I don't even really think about it. And it just, you'd be like free to float around in your best, your best gendered self and do whatever you want. Okay, caught up on comments. So here is Hunter's response, because Hunter obviously got a lot of attention for liking the post that I just read. So she says, also, while we're here, I hold absolutely no hatred towards non-binary folks. I agree with another trans girl's post in which she pointed out an imbalance in the visibility and space taken up between non-binary folks and binary trans women, particularly those of color and or those who have resulted to sex work as a means of survival, and I think deserves attention, reevaluation as far as resources and platforms go within the LGBTQ plus community. I'm not a transmedicalist, and my ideology around transness does not align with transmedicalism nor disdain towards non-binary identifying people. And I just call bullshit on this whole thing, because the whole post, hopefully, as we all saw in real time as I read it, I know it was broken up, but still, uh, was pure transmedicalism. That's what it was. It was a transmedicalist post. So to say that you liked this post and commented on it, and again, I don't want to like overanalyze celebrities and what they do and like what they like and what it means, but you know, that's a pretty tacit like signing off on the post itself. And I said before that like those inclusions of Black trans women right at the end is what allows other people to like your hateful post and then be able to have this like plausible deniability where you're like, oh no, it was just that end part that I agreed with, like the thing that everyone agrees with, that's what I was liking. And you know, I've made the example that like this would be like me as uh well, maybe the dynamics aren't exactly the same, but say like me as a white person, there's a post that was like racism, and then at the end it was like free healthcare for everyone, and I liked it and commented on it in support. And then when people rightfully called me out, I was like, oh no, I just like, I love free healthcare, I just want free healthcare for everybody, that's what I was agreeing with. Like, it's obviously that would be wrong. Obviously, like, people would have issues with that. And it would not be okay for me to do that or say that, right? Like, I'm clearly supporting a racist ideology. So this is what Hunter has done here, in my opinion, is like support a transmedicalist post and then use the like, cover your ass statement at the end as a cover for liking it. And, she doubles down on a lot of the same stuff. It's like, I don't have any disdain for non-binary people, and yet I think they take up too much space and they get too many resources and they need to sit down and they need to stop talking. It's like, well, that sounds fairly disdainful to me, personally. And again, I'm not really sure what they're referring to. Like, where are all these resources? Like, where are all these platforms that are only centering non-binary voices? I'm sure some exist somewhere, maybe, but like, I don't think that this is just even true. It just feels like saying things that maybe emotionally feel true, but are not like actually true. Like, if we had the data, I don't think it would reflect that. And not to invalidate people's feelings for data, because that's a whole discussion. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it feels like, again, when I was reading through a lot of people like talking about this incident over and over, it was like, oh yeah, like, I don't agree with, these statements and blah blah, but like, non-binary people really do need to sit down and shut up. And it's like, okay. And then there's just a feeling that it's not even like take up less space, it's like stop talking altogether. And I think it's a shame. I think, again, it's very similar to people telling bisexuals to shut up because they're not pure gay. And so they don't, they can hide and they don't have to uh experience discrimination if they don't want to. And it's like, hopefully everyone on the stream at least like understands that that's incredibly harmful. It's just because, I'm someone who suffers from chronic illnesses that have for the most part been invisible, and I'm also autistic, and I've been able to mask really well, and it fucking destroyed me. So, like, as someone who's experienced a lot of things that are invisible, it's like, of course, I can see the type of privilege I have, and I kind of hate calling it a privilege, but I can understand how someone, I understand the framework. Like, I am someone who can maybe go out in the world and not be pegged as any particular thing, especially before. I feel like I look a little bit more queer now, but especially before. Um, and I'm in a bigger body, which targets me a bit more. But yeah, I can like navigate the world and not necessarily draw any particular attention to any of these things that are going on underneath. But it also makes it harder to get medical care. It makes it harder to be taken seriously with friends and family when you're not my friends because they're amazing, but before, when I had a corporate job, like, I would try to ask for things that I needed to navigate these things better as a disabled person. And it was really hard to get any accommodations because I didn't have this like overt, obvious disability that they could look at and be like, oh, yeah, okay, we have to accommodate that. Like, same with bisexuals, it sucks to date someone of an opposite gender and be genuinely like happy or in love or whatever the case may be, but constantly, constantly, constantly have to feel that in the back of your head that like everyone just thinks you're straight and your queerness has been completely erased. And that sucks. It's not okay. And is it as bad as some of the stuff that other people go through? I don't know. No, I guess, but like, is that really the metric that we're using for how we're going to sympathize with each other and connect in our own community? I hope not. And, grading experiences on like a level of trauma to me feels pretty fucked up and like self-defeating. I don't really want all of us. It's not that the trauma isn't there and that we don't want to, like, I don't want to talk about or acknowledge it or process it, like, I very much do, but it's also like, is that actually all of our identities are literally trauma informed? I hope not. I hope, like, our identities are bigger and better than that, They're a way out of the trauma. They're a way to name why we've had trauma and a way to feel pride and find community and to advocate for ourselves. Uh there's a quote I found on one of the Reddit threads. It's from Kaylin Conrad, and it may have been paraphrased here. For those who don't know, Kaylin is a YouTuber who's non-binary, and I feel like they are non-binary very much in the way that I'm non-binary. So it's been really cool to find their channel, just in terms of like sort of how their aesthetic and everything. Um, but Kaylin said, if you identify yourself, and again, this is paraphrased, if you define yourself by your oppression, you need to be oppressed to continue to exist. And I think that's what we see here, right? We see people who have defined themselves based on their oppression, and therefore they need that oppression to continue to exist. So this is a matter for them of feeling like my identity is being threatened by these other people whose identities don't work in the same way that mine does. But it isn't, it's very self-defeating. And when I look at transmedicalism, which we'll now talk about specifically, I see this as a very like right-wing conservative viewpoint. I don't really see it much different, ironically, than being a TERF. And I think we'll see, as we probably have like already seen in some of the stuff that was said. But this is not like, I think people want to promote their transmedicalism as like almost this politically neutral thing, but it's not. It's very much not. So this post is by GSRCU Albany on Instagram. I have links to all of this stuff in the show notes as well, the resources I'm going to mention. So this is linked there if you want to have access to it after the stream. And I forget what this stands for. It's like gender something something center. I'm such a good researcher and streamer. But I really like this. I just love when people put something together that's really easy to reference. So what is transmedicalism? Transmedicalism refers to the belief that one's trans identity is contingent upon them experiencing gender dysphoria, which is distress because of gender incongruence, or undergoing medical treatment when transitioning. So this is saying transmedicalists don't think that you're trans if you don't experience dysphoria, which is, and they define dysphoria as a deeply uncomfortable, painful, unsettling feeling around your own body. So, and it has to be specifically gender related. So if you're a trans man, you might have dysphoria over your breasts. If you're a trans woman, you might have dysphoria over your facial hair. So things like, it has to be very specifically related to your body, your biology, and your gender identity. And in their words too, it's often not just that like you experience some level of dysphoria, but it has to be this level of dysphoria where like you're suicidal, you're having really intense mental health issues. Like it's very extreme when they talk about it. So I think I saw posts by other binary trans people who agreed with transmedicalists and got into some of their spaces, and then were kind of like run out because their dysphoria didn't match this level of dysphoria that transmedicalists say you need to have in order to be really trans. So again, they're centering their identity on this extreme level of trauma and discomfort, and their identity is formed around that. So there's nothing really euphoric or liberating about their identity. It's just like, I went through this hell. So anyone else who hasn't gone through hell like me isn't real. They continue to say many transmedicalists believe that individuals who identify as transgender but don't experience dysphoria or undergo medical transition are not genuinely transgender. So again, it's like rooted in, you have to have this trauma in order to be a valid part of the community. So they go on to say transmedicalism upholds white supremacy because it disproportionately attacks trans individuals who do not experience gender within the Western binary. It ignores gender as a social, cultural construct and invalidates cultural identities, especially in the case where a trans person doesn't want to medically transition or doesn't experience dysphoria. Water break. Okay, so this is something I wanted to dive into a little bit. I think perhaps for some people it could be confusing to understand how a trans person could be trans and also not experience dysphoria. And I think within a Western construct of gender, it is confusing, right? Because like we have this binary, you fit into it or you don't. And it is so heavily imposed that how could you not experience discomfort if you don't fit into it? But there's a few things. So, for one, I think if we look at someone who is being raised in a way where their gender is being affirmed at every step, they still could very well have very crippling dysphoria. It could happen. But I think probably not. You know, if you have a kid who from the age of, say, 5 or 6 is like, I'm a girl. I know I'm a girl. And their parents are like, cool, you know, and they get to change their name. They get to change their pronouns. Their parents respect all of that. They get to dress however they want. Everyone at school respects that. They get to go on puberty blockers when it's appropriate and then get to move on to hormone therapy and medical surgery if that's what they want. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think that that person is experiencing a situation that is kind of outside this construct where people are just saying, okay, okay, we'll support you and we believe you and we validate you. So even this idea that like the dysphoria has to happen for binary trans people, it's like it's not necessarily going to be the same for everyone, because a lot of people, if they are supported, and again, not in every case, like some people are still going to have very bad dysphoria, but you're creating a situation where even a binary trans person who has a very similar set of desires and their identity is very similar to another binary trans person is maybe going to have a very different experience of euphoria, dysphoria, and all of those things. There's a lot of people, like I know a lot of trans people who are like, I'm good. You know, like I love myself. Things are fine. Like it's not necessarily part of the experience to have dysphoria. So that's just in a Western context. And then I think when we look at other cultures, we can see even more so like why this would be the case. And I think a lot of that can be part of it. Like if you have a culture that is generally more accepting of other genders, people tend to be pretty fine with who they are and how they are. Um, I pulled up, and people might just have different frameworks. So, just as a few examples, there's the Mushe, and I apologize ahead of time if I'm mispronouncing anything. I'm doing my best. Mushe people in Mexico who identify as a third gender rather than identifying as a trans woman. And none of these are like absolute. And I think in modern times, things have shifted a bit, you know, with social media and everything. But they, you know, will wear feminine clothes, they will do all these things, but they identify as a third gender. So again, you're going to have people like the whole construct of a binary framework doesn't apply. And so they're going to have a different perception of their own gender and a different experience of their own gender that isn't going to match up with what we have here. The Katui people in Thailand similarly will identify as assigned male at birth a lot of times rather than as a trans woman. So a lot of these things colonization has kind of ruined, but they also are in a culture where like they have special roles within society and hadn't experienced a lot of oppression. Well, I might be overstating that, but anyway, their gender was accepted in a broad sense. We'll say it that way. The Two-Spirit framework for Indigenous people. Now, Two-Spirit is a very general, broad framework that's given to, you know, the over 1,000 nations between Canada and the United States. And a lot of times it gets applied in like an LGBTQ framework, but that's not really how it works for them. Traditionally, these gender roles would have their individual names and nuances in each tribe, but they would be based on gender role rather than identity, which I think for us is hard to wrap our heads around. So we have roles that come with our gender, like as a woman, there's a certain set of expectations there. But here it's kind of reversed. It's like the role that you play in the tribe is really what determines your gender. So again, they're not going to have dysphoria in this way that like we could identify and recognize and be able to like say, oh, that's what I had too. It's just like a very different framework. And even here in the US, stud culture, so studs are a role that was developed or an identity that was developed specifically within Black lesbian culture to identify and separate themselves from like white butch culture. And that is another thing, like studs really have kind of their own experience of gender, and some of them are non-binary, some of them are not, but it's really like it's just a very different experience than what like a white lesbian would go through. It's a whole different thing, and it's of course been appropriated by white lesbians, because what isn't? But those are just a couple examples of like, if you go to different cultures, and even within our own culture, if you go to non-white or BIPOC cultures, people are experiencing gender in so many different ways. And so to apply this very specific dysphoria framework as the gate through which you have to pass in order to be considered trans is inherently white supremacist and just like wrong-headed. It's just misguided. When we look at Western culture, the cisgender construct was created specifically to differentiate white women from everyone else, from all other women. So we could even argue, like, if you read White Tears, Brown Scars, which is a book I fucking could not recommend more. It's so good. I just read it. She talks a lot about that in this book because, she's looking at what she calls strategic white womanhood, which is, the white tears, when white women weaponize their femininity to put people of color in harm's way. And when she talks about this, she does a really good job of breaking down that the cisgender idea of womanhood is inherently specifically for white women. And so by not being a white woman, you are already inherently having a queer experience. And there are a lot of Black trans women, binary Black trans women, who will say this as well. Like, just by not being a white woman, you are inherently having a queer experience in the world as a Black person, and especially as a Black woman. So again, trying to say that anyone who's a real trans woman is going to have this very specific set of experiences also kicks out, first of all, you're kicking out Black and brown non-binary people from that, like, which just kind of blows your whole include Black trans women. It makes that sound ridiculous because you're cutting out this whole swath of people who may not have, met this criteria that you say for them to be in the community. And then even with Black trans women, their experience of gender is going to be different than yours because they're not white and they don't have access to white womanhood, which is, the cisgender pinnacle of womanhood. It's the threshold that you have to pass in order to be considered fully a woman and therefore someone worthy of protect and care and all of these other things. So that's a huge fucking issue. And that's why, like, that was the biggest reason I wanted to talk about this today, is because I think it's really important I think these conversations can happen. You're like, this is kind of messy and I don't really know and I don't want to get involved. And I think it's okay to not get too involved, but I think it's also important to be able to recognize what is going on here and that this is definitely rooted in white supremacy. It just is. You create a construct that not everyone can fit into, and then the people outside of it are the bad ones. And, this is like an assimilation strategy of, all right, we're going to be the good ones, everyone else are the bad ones. And then, mix in some neoliberalism for like, we're going to pay lip service to like one particular marginalized group to make ourselves sound like we give a shit when we really don't. And if you look at it, like Hunter Shcafer is young, she's extremely white, and she's wealthy, and she has had access to all of these things her whole life. Like she, I believe, was able to go on puberty blockers. She was able to get access to the things that she wanted to get to affirm her gender. And so it feels very rich, and it feels very much like what we see with conservatives and, extremist kind of people all the time, which is there's always these people who are talking about threats to them or their community who have had access to everything that they've ever wanted and have never lost anything. It's like Trump with immigrants. Like Trump has never lost a job to anyone. Like he's never not had money. It's like very rich again that you're coming out here and acting like something that you want is at risk when like you've always had access to it and been able to do whatever it is that you want to do. And I think everyone should have that, right? Like I think everyone should have access to these things. I'm glad when people do have access, but talk about like someone who should not be taking up space, someone who has not had to have this struggle and who's always had access to these resources should not be the person stepping in to tell other people to sit down and shut up. I think that's really fucking violent, honestly, and just super not okay. Let me just check my notes real quick. There's this person on Twitter who said, the post was inherently about transmedicalism, and the inclusion of trans BIPOC only came in the end as a mollifying strategy. Exactly. So, yeah, it's very problematic. It's very problematic, and it centers like a very specific Western trans experience as like the trans experience for the entire world, even for the entire country, when again there's just so many striations of different communities having very different experiences and using very different frameworks that like you're erasing people's experiences and voices, which is a bullshit. All right, so similarly, transmedicalism is classist. It's also important to note that when looking at the demographic of transmedicalists, it's mostly made up of white trans folks who are able to afford hormones and surgeries. The expectation that trans people must medically transition invalidates trans people who can't afford hormones, surgeries, voice trainings, etc. So a lot of times, like there are a lot of posts by non-binary trans people who are like, one of two things. Either I desperately want these things, I just don't have access, right? So, like, you're saying I'm not a real trans person because you're looking at me and not seeing a body that you identify as trans when I just don't have access to make my body any different. Or I do these things and I still get identified as cisgender. Like there was one person who's like, I'm on hormone therapy, I wear men's clothes, like I've done everything I can do to present as male, and I still get called a cis woman in these spaces. And it's really fucked up. Like I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. So it exposes that this isn't like not a real argument. It's just an argument used to, you know, browbeat a certain demographic and to act like victims when a lot of times they're actually people with a lot of resources and power who have not experienced, certainly I'm sure have experienced transphobia, but haven't experienced the silencing that they claim, is the real danger. This might surprise y'all, but transmedicalism is transphobic. So anyone who's been paying attention and has an ear for these things may have picked up that like a lot of these transmedicalist arguments could be turf arguments and you wouldn't know the difference. Like a lot of them are based on, what kind of experience you've had based on your gender and who's had more trauma and whose body is biologically or physically doing what and looks what way. So a lot of these arguments just line up with directly with transphobia. Um, so the post says many transmedicalists expect trans men to act masculine and trans women to be feminine. Otherwise, they're not really trans. However, transmedicalists do not expect cisgender folks to conform to these standards. These standards are held to make cis people feel comfortable at the expense of trans people. And then just key takeaways. So, needless to say, the trans community is incredibly beautiful and diverse. Every trans person's experience is different. No trans person needs dysphoria or has to medically transition to be valid. Transmedicalism is a way to police trans bodies while maintaining the Western binary and has no place within the trans community. Here, here. All right. I think that's all I have to share. Ooh, there I am. So I think the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit more is dysphoria and just how I think I touched on a lot of it, but I want to just say, so there's a couple little things to add in here. So for one, I haven't talked about neuroqueerness at all, but everyone knows it's my favorite thing in the world. Neuroqueerness is it's a lot of like queerness is a lot of things, neuroqueerness is a lot of things, but we can say it's a critical theory that intersects neurodivergence with queerness. And anyone who's in the neurodivergent community or knows people who are probably knows we're a very queer bunch. We are disproportionately queer compared to the rest of the population. And there are queer theories that are specific to the neurodivergent experience that say that they're kind of inseparable. Like my autism is sort of absolutely linked and interwoven with my queerness. So, for instance, I may have talked about this before, but like I usually keep my head, well, I'm very lazy, so I always let my hair grow out just because I don't like to do it all the time, but I like to keep my head buzzed. And when I did it, I experienced what I think was gender euphoria because I used to really like my haircut. I used to have really cool different haircuts and I always had like I always like objectively was like this is a good haircut, but I would constantly be in the mirror just like adjusting and not feeling right and I would change my hair all the time and I always feel very uncomfortable. And then when I buzzed my head, it was like that's it. Like that's what I've been looking for. And it's weird because again, like I had haircuts that objectively I really really liked and I thought were very cool and like would maybe like to have again, but I just feel so much more comfortable with a buzzed head. And I think part of it's my gender and I think part of it's my autism. A lot of autistic people love having their head buzzed because they don't have to worry about their hair. They don't have to feel it. Like a lot of us have sensory issues, so sometimes like having hair on your face or your neck can be really uncomfortable. um it's lower maintenance. Well, it's lower maintenance if you don't bleach it and dye it all the time. But technically, it should be lower maintenance. And like, it feels like mine at least feels really soft when I buzz it. And it's just kind of like tactily pleasing and just feels comfortable. So it's hard for me to say how much of wanting to have this haircut is to affirm my gender and how much is it to just be comfortable in my autistic body. And for me, I don't think there's much of a difference, to be honest with you. I think that those things are just so deeply tied together that it is the same thing. Like this is a neuroqueer affirming thing for me. And I feel that way about a lot of stuff. Like the clothes I want to wear have an element of gender neutrality or maybe like very slight hint of like being towards the masculine, but they also are very soft and very comfortable. And I really like having I hate when it gets hot out because I really like having like long sleeve things on and, sweatshirts and stuff. I just feel better when I'm wrapped up in something. And again, that's part gender and that's part autism. So there's like a very nuanced, kind of complicated, hard to explore neuroqueer experience that a lot of specifically autistic people, but I think a lot of people in the neurodivergent community experience. And so this framework that's being put out by transmedicalists is just not helpful. It's really antagonistic towards, I think, towards neuroqueer people. Like I feel that my agender identity is extremely autistic. Autistic people, a lot of times gender does not make sense to us. And so we end up being somewhere on the non-binary spectrum because we're like, we just don't get it. We don't really want to be a part of it. We don't want to be held down by it. So for me, it's like, yeah, gender doesn't make sense. I just don't have a gender. I use she, they pronouns, which is another thing that the transmedicalists love shitting all over. But for me, it's like, I know most people are going to interpret me as a she, so it's fine because no pronoun makes me feel good. Like, no pronoun is the right one for me. So it's like, I'm just path of least resistance. It's fine. And that's it. So, but does that make me any less queer or less trans? I hope not. I think in some ways, like, that's the most queer you can be, is being like, I don't, none of this makes sense and I'm opting out. And there's no hierarchy, there's no competition. It's a joke. Calm down. But yeah, I think the autistic experience is one that is very underrepresented in these conversations, and one that I wanted to make sure to include because it is, for those of us with brains that work differently, and for those of us that are highly policed around our expressions and our feelings and how we externalize stuff, I think having even more instances of being policed around how we're feeling on the inside or how we're expressing ourselves on the outside is just really fucking harmful and violent. Like, autistic people are dealing with that all the time enough already. We don't also need trans people telling us like we're not doing it right. We're being weird, we're not fitting into this like box that we're supposed to fit into. That's like our whole lives about everything. And we shouldn't be making people in our own community, especially those who are going to be, like a neurodivergent person is probably going to be more marginalized than a neurotypical person. Like, we don't need to be punching down at these people. And I know there's probably not, for a lot of transmedicalists, maybe like an overt, intentional targeting of people on the spectrum, but the eugenics are always there. They're always there, simmering under everything. And I just think this is another way that, whether intentional or not, like, is rooted in people are supposed to perform and behave in a very certain way under a certain set of rules. And if you don't meet those, then you're invalid. Your existence is invalid. And that's something that disabled people have dealt with literally forever. And it's very violent and very toxic. Let me see. Do I have anything else? Also, opt out. That was very funny. 77 minutes to finally get around to shaved head is the best head. Yep. Oh, we have a nasty person. Let me block them. Koch, this is a really good comment. Oops, sorry. Mind-body dichotomy is also very binary thinking. Yes. And that's a big problem. I think it's something we can learn, or other people can learn from disabled people, and I think autistic people in particular. So I think I've always heard that from friends. Like, I will notice how things affect me. I'm very sensitive to like how everything is affecting me. Like, a lot of you have heard me talk about like coffee and how caffeine sensitive I am, or how drugs interact in my body, or I'm really sensitive to heat or whatever. But I'm so aware all the time of like what is happening. And I think in a way where, yeah, there isn't really this like huge separation of mind and body for me in the way that there might be for other people. And so I think it's hard for other people to like understand the experience that I'm having in my own body. Um, I feel like there was something I wanted to say about dysphoria, but I can't remember. And I don't see it in here. Anyway, I've probably said enough. We've been going for almost 90 minutes. I'm sure y'all get it. Yeah. So in conclusion, transmedicalism, it's real bad. There shouldn't be such a schism in the trans binary versus non-binary camps. If there are non-binary people, especially white people who are taking up too much space, they should stop doing that. But to tell anyone in the community that they need to shut up entirely and go away entirely is super problematic and not helpful and not going to lead us towards any kind of, significant liberation. But it only helps the right and affirms cis sexism, which is bad for all of us. And just see transmedicalism for what it is, which again is a like white supremacist, which is inherently racist, inherently supports patriarchy, and is inherently classist as well as ableist. So it's not good. This is my super hot take for the day. Transmedicalism, not good. So anyway, thanks for everyone for coming. This was really fun. Again, I apologize I couldn't get an amazing panel of people together like I wanted to, but I am working on a panel for trans sex, which I'm very excited about. I know of one or two people I definitely want to ask to be on who I think will be really into it, but I may be falling short on that as well. So if anyone has any suggestions for someone who might want to come on, if you're a person who might want to come on, I know not everyone is comfortable talking about explicitly about sex on the internet. So that's where I know a lot of trans people, but like not a lot of them are wanting to sign up for an unscripted sex talk that's going to be recorded and exist in perpetuity. So I'm open to any suggestions, but I'm really excited about that. But yes, I want to thank you for coming today. And if you've enjoyed what happened here, could I say that any more weirdly? We do have a Patreon now, so you can find the link for that in the description box below. And we appreciate any support that you can and want to give us. So thank you all, and we'll see you on the next one.